I'd known love, or at least a form of it. I was starting to be programmed. I didn't realise, nor did I understand, a lot of my actions would be wrong. Some, even cruel. I started to copy what I'd seen daily. Clive screaming at his wife, Nan abusing Caroline, Wenzel attacking Bernie. I learnt to believe a few inaccuracies, and by believe, I mean I knew them to be true. They were fact. My words were a powerful tool. I could lie easily to escape punishment, even if I deserved it. I could predict people's actions because of their body language and tone of voice. If I knew how they felt, I could use this to my advantage. I knew to feel good all I had to do was control another, and that was okay to do because every male I'd known apart from Alan was doing it. I'd started to understand Wenzel got a physical and sexual kick when he controlled people. If he told Bernie she was useless, she became below him and he became useful. If he made her cry, he felt strong. He physically felt superhuman. If she was depressed because of him, at the same time it was a circle. If she didn't look happy when he wanted her to, then he felt useless as a husband, which he was. He'd fix this by making her do what he wanted. Smile was his favourite quick fix. Mum would for a half second. She knew his games as well as we did, and we all knew little ways to rebel against them. The split-second smile was one of her ways. By her fake smiling, he felt in control and happier. By her not holding a full smile, she felt more in control of his ways, and therefore not as controlled. I'd started seeing it everywhere, and not only was it normal, but it was right, and exactly as it should be. I remember Caroline being told off because she felt sick and wasn't eating her food as fast as Wenzel would like. I looked at her with disgust. I knew how she felt, and I'd been where she was more times than I liked to. I'd made the choice to join Wenzel's ways. I hated myself all the more. Caroline looked at me like I'd slapped her. "What's your fucking problem?" Wenzel shouted at her. "Feel sick," Caroline replied. "Eat your food," he said, loud enough for all to hear, but without shouting. I didn't look at her and tucked into my own as I waited for Wenzel to hit me. He didn't. He laughed. "You heard your brother. Eat your food." A few days of me siding with Daddy, and I was rewarded with two things. Firstly, I was allowed out on my own, which had never happened before, and only happened this time because when I asked Mum, had said no, and Wenzel would disagree with anything she said. My second reward was that he would take my word over Caroline's, and sometimes Bernie's too. I knew I'd made my life easier, but I also knew this gave me leverage. I could prevent him hurting them by making him laugh. They would hate me because I'd put them down, but they wouldn't be hit either. I got special treatment. I could watch TV and eat at the same time. I knew how his brain worked, and I could use it to my cause. On one occasion, Caroline was talking to Jonathan. I can't recall what was said. It was trivial. It was normal kids stuff. Wenzel piped up, "What was that?" Because we weren't allowed to talk unless spoken to, never to each other at dinner or in his presence. My mum was okay with it, but he wasn't. I repeated what was said, which was something like, "Do you want to play Lego later, Jonathan?" Wenzel blew up. "Lego? Fucking Lego? You're supposed to be eating, you little shit, not talking." He was red in the face and looking to hit people. It was seconds away. "Upstairs, 20 slaps with a slipper, knickers down," I said, and carried on eating, not looking at either of them. I could feel Caroline's eyes on me. She hated me, but she didn't know what I'd just done. Either he'd beat me rotten for taking his role, or he'd calm down because I suggested it, and as it was his normal suggestion, he'd feel it was the right thing to do, but that it didn't need to be done, because everyone now knew that it had been suggested. There was no control in knowing what was going to happen. Control comes from shock and fear. I chomped my egg down, smiling, waiting for the outcome. He laughed. "Maybe later. Eat your food," he said, nodding at me calmly. I nodded and mouthed a, "Sorry, Dad." I knew my place. Below him and above them. And I was starting to get the same kicks of control that he got. Chapter 12. My rewards had grown, and being able to see Conran whenever I wanted was one of them. He wanted to swap my Meccano for his Lego, and I'd agreed, so he took the Meccano home. Conran was okay, about a year older than me and very pale. I'd play on his Master System console with him whilst his mum was with clients in her bedroom. The story goes that she was a masseuse, but everyone knew the truth. Alan told me she was on the game years ago. It took me a long time to realise that didn't mean she played Sonic the Hedgehog. Conran put the control pad down and went around the corner of his high sleeper bed. He told me to wait there, so I did for a few minutes until he shouted me. I went to him and he had his trousers down round his ankles, touching himself. "Touch it," he said, pointing it at me. I stood there looking at it, and then at his face. "Want to touch it?" he said. I turned around and walked out. He was pulling his trousers up behind me and shuffled along. "Please don't tell anyone," he begged. I nodded by the front door. "Lego still okay?" I asked. He nodded, and I left. A few days later, Conran was at our house, which was unheard of. We rarely got to play together, as brother and sisters, let alone have friends over. We totally didn't know what to do, but I knew there was no way I was playing Sonic the Hedgehog with Conrad again. So we watched TV instead, sat on my bed. When Wenzel got home, he asked what we'd been up to all day. I told him, "Just watching TV," pointing at the portable. "Good lads, come on then, let's take Conrad home," he replied. We sat down for the evening meal and Wenzel told me, "You can't find something else to do but watch TV? That's the last time Conrad comes over." I didn't argue, and we all had an early night. I went to get a drink from the bathroom sink, and before I knew it, Wenzel was behind me. It was my mistake for thinking I was untouchable. "What you doing out of bed?" he asked. "I heard something. I was checking what it was. I was checking what she was doing, but she's asleep," I lied, referring to Caroline. He grunted and pointed to my room. My lies were coming easier each time. This cycle went on for a long time. 1 minute I was the useless punch bag that belongs by the wall where he'd throw things at me if I moved. He started with socks, slippers, things that don't do much damage. Then one day when I slipped and fell because I stood on the side of my foot to take the pain away from my calf, his bunch of keys hit the wall next to my head. I jumped. "Pick them up," he said. I bent down and fell because it hurt. He laughed. I got his keys and gave them to him and stood there like a lemon waiting for instructions. "What? Back on the wall," he said. I returned to the corner waiting, always waiting. More than once those keys hit me square between the shoulder blades, and want to or not I hit the floor in pain, stood bolt upright again. The next mate I'd be the chest buddy and telltale butter wouldn't melt. It all depended on his mood, and how I played it. I'd been out with Conran. No sooner had I closed the door behind me and I heard the screams. Caroline was upstairs with Wenzel. I ran up knowing they'd not heard me over the noise. He'd never punched Caroline before. It was always a hit with an open hand. "Off," he said as I reached the top of the stairs. He was sat on the edge of the single bed, as he was when he spanked me. Caroline pulled her knickers down as I walked in. She had nothing else on. He pulled her over his knee and went to back away. "Where you going?" he said. I stood there stock still. Must have slapped her over 100 times. When she pushed her arms back, he'd grab her wrists and slap her arms instead. After Caroline had taken that beating, I tried to keep him calm, though it was dangerous. He never gave a slap because it was deserved. It was always because he enjoyed it. I knew Alan hadn't been like that, and after seeing what I'd put Caroline through, I realised I wasn't like that either. I'd blamed myself because I was out when she took that beating. It was late, and a couple of months after Alan's funeral, which I don't remember going to, but remember wanting to. I know it was nearly bedtime, but knew seconds before that we'd not be sleeping. I had a great antenna for danger. As soon as the door went thud, I knew bad things had arrived. Wenzel looked scared. I glanced at Mom. "Upstairs, all of you," she said. We legged it. Me last. I had to make it look like I was running. Caroline took Jonathan's hand and was taking steps 2 at a time and almost dragging him. I'd just reached the top when the door burst open and 2 men came in, Clive and my great-uncle Phil, who was a renowned wimp. He was the guy who'd always shout his mouth off or put the boot in when someone's down, but he would never do the heavy work himself. He was nothing but a shit-stirrer, as Alan used to say. He moved Bernie into the kitchen by pushing her in the back and closed the door. "Just a chat, stay there," he said as Clive pushed Wenzel into the living room. I'd made myself small by bending down and looking through the cracks in the banister railings. They were cracked white paint. The living room door was partially open. There was lots of shouting going on. Clive was pacing. Wenzel was curled up in the corner between the sofa and the gas fire. I'm sure he was hiding. Bernie came out of the kitchen. Luckily she didn't see me. She entered the living room and the door was more closed, but it still had a gap. I heard the ironing board rattle and Wenzel scream. Clive was over 6 feet tall with enormous hands. He had to have boots especially made for him. He grabbed the ironing board from the floor again. I saw him hold it above his head by the sides as Bernie was dragged away by Phil. Clive let fly with the ironing board, slamming it several times into a curled-up Wenzel. He didn't fight back. He just lay there and took it, till he couldn't curl up anymore, and he had to straighten out. He straightened out face down, which is when Phil started putting the boot in. I watched the ironing board slam into his back, and then after a couple of minutes at the most, the noise stopped, and I went upstairs. Clive shouted something, and the front door slammed shut. Wenzel went to the hospital via ambulance. Although Phil and Clive hadn't seen me on the stairs as they left, Bernie had. She sent me back up with a look. Wenzel was out of hospital less than 2 days later on crutches. Apparently they'd broken his back. At least that's what he tells everyone. Yes, he looked a lot of pain. However, he was able to walk, and with him, you just never knew what's fact. What was definitely real, though, was his fear. He was absolutely petrified of Clive and anyone connected to him. Wenzel hadn't been home half a day before he told us, "Grab some clothes, we're leaving." A normal person would have called the police or got an injunction. A normal person may have called friends and families for somewhere safe to stay before moving his wife and children. A normal person may even have had money to one side in case it's ever needed in an emergency. Wenzel was not a normal person, nor was he mentally ill or crazy. He was simply a psychopath, a person who lives for control and thrives on it. We were bundled into the car, Bernie in the front seat despite her pleas of agoraphobia. Jonathan, Jody and Caroline side by side in the back, and me, well, I was wedged against the back sloping window. Chapter 13. Wenzel had this idea that social services would immediately house us because we had 4 children, a mentally ill wife, and had recently been beaten up. He was sure that a few hours down at social services base he'd have a house well out of Macclesfield. He was wrong. We'd made ourselves intentionally homeless and nothing could be done. Wenzel decided if we couldn't get access to the property, we weren't intentionally homeless anymore, so we drove back to the property and posted the keys to the letterbox. By the time we got back to social services, it was closed. We slept in the blue Volvo estate. I was curled up and couldn't move without kicking Jonathan, so I didn't move. I gazed out of the window. I don't recall every trip we did in that car, but I know Bernie tried to cheer us up by playing tapes. I heard Like a Prayer by Madonna and I Will Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston so many times. Wenzel at first would sing with us and play I Spy. We'd have sandwiches in the car for dinner, and on one occasion my carrier bag flew out from underneath my sandwich and wrapped itself in the rearview mirror. Wenzel turned red and pulled off the main road, all the while shouting at Bernie for not keeping us under control. "Do something useful instead of just sitting there," he stormed. "Like what?" she asked, echoing all of our thoughts. What were we to do but sit there? We were homeless. "Well, you can start by not listening to this shit," he said, flipping the cassette out the window, throwing it at her. Flipping the cassette out of the player and throwing it at her, sorry. "Let's have some real music," he said, smiling into the rearview mirror behind him. So let's say I learnt every song by the Police and the Eagles. That was his favourite music. At night we would stop by the car park in Wilmslow and have chip shop chips shared between us. Mum rarely ate, and often Wenzel would take ours just as a control kick. I'd always put some in my pocket for night time when I got real hungry. The pattern went on for weeks rather than days, although I can't recall an exact amount of time. It's hard to describe what it's like in a tin can in the summer days packed up tight. I accidentally touched the plastic beneath the window a number of times. It was so hot that it hurt. Other times I'd get down from the back window and sit with Caroline, Jonathan and Jody, as it was the only time I could be uncurled. I couldn't stretch out, but I didn't have to have one position and the numbness that I had previously. My arm would be wedged against the door, and the heat would soon be too much, so I'd crawl back to my window out of the way. One evening we had chips and sausage. I was hungry, but I was more pleased to be out of the car. I could stand, but not walk very well. Caroline played on the swings with another family in the park. Soon they were playing frisbee together. Jonathan asked if he